Tonight, we will journey back more than 4,000 years to a time when the world was younger, when kingdoms rose along the banks of a single life-giving river, and when the mysteries of eternity were carved into stone that still stands today. As night falls over the silent desert that surrounds this ancient valley, we will explore a civilization that flourished under relentless sun, where gods walked beside mortals, where the rhythm of the seasons was written in the rising and falling of water, and where every structure, every ritual, every grain of wheat harvested from rich soil told a story of survival, belief, and profound connection to the land itself. This is a journey not of heroes or legends, but of historical truths, of daily rhythms and sacred customs, of architecture and environment, of faith woven into the fabric of existence. Let us drift gently backward through time to the civilization that emerged along the Nile, that eternal river flowing northward through desert and delta, and discover what life truly meant in ancient Egypt. The Nile River stretched over 4,000 miles from the East African highlands to the Mediterranean Sea, a ribbon of water cutting through an otherwise barren landscape of sand and stone. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, meaning the Black Land, referring to the dark, fertile soil deposited annually by the river's floods, while the surrounding desert was Deshret, the Red Land, hostile and lifeless. This stark contrast between abundance and desolation shaped everything about Egyptian civilization. The river was not merely a source of water. It was the very heartbeat of existence, the divine artery through which life itself flowed. Without it, there would be no crops, no settlements, no temples rising toward the sky, no civilization at all. The annual flooding, known as the inundation, arrived with remarkable predictability between August and September each year, transforming the landscape into a vast, shimmering expanse of water that submerged the floodplain under nearly 1.5 meters of moisture. This was not the chaotic, destructive flooding of other great rivers, but a gentle, measured rising that the Egyptians came to understand, anticipate, and eventually harness with extraordinary skill. When the floodwaters receded in October, they left behind a gift more precious than gold: silt, a rich, dark sediment carried from the Ethiopian highlands, naturally fertilized and perfectly suited for cultivation. Farmers would then begin planting their crops in soil that required no additional fertilization, no extensive preparation, merely the scattering of seed across the moist earth. The crops, primarily barley and emmer wheat, would grow with minimal intervention throughout the cooler months, ripening between March and May when the harvest began. This cyclical pattern, repeated year after year with only slight variation, gave ancient Egyptian society a sense of order, predictability, and divine favor that permeated every aspect of their culture. The flooding was commemorated as a sacred event, celebrated with festivals and offerings, a time when the gods had once again smiled upon the land and renewed the promise of life. To maximize the benefits of this annual miracle, the Egyptians developed sophisticated irrigation systems based on a technique called basin irrigation. Earthen walls were constructed in a crisscross pattern across fields, creating enclosed basins that would trap and hold the flood water longer than the land would naturally retain it. This allowed the soil to become thoroughly saturated, ensuring that moisture would remain deep in the earth, even as the surface dried under the relentless sun. Once the basins were fully soaked, the remaining water would be drained into adjacent basins that needed additional moisture, creating an interconnected network of water management that required careful planning and communal cooperation. What is remarkable about this system is that it was managed locally by farmers themselves rather than through centralized state control. Though the image of the Scorpion King cutting into an irrigation ditch around 3100 BCE suggests that water management held profound symbolic importance and was associated with royal authority from the earliest periods of Egyptian unification. The Nile provided more than agricultural abundance. It served as the primary transportation route for the entire civilization, a natural highway that connected Upper Egypt in the south to Lower Egypt in the north, and eventually to the Mediterranean world beyond. The geography of the river made transportation remarkably efficient. The current flowed northward, allowing boats to drift downstream with minimal effort, while the prevailing winds blew from the north, filling sails and pushing vessels southward against the current. This dual advantage meant that Egyptians could travel in both directions with relative ease, using oars and the current when heading north, and raising sails to harness the wind when traveling south. The importance of this navigation pattern was so deeply ingrained in Egyptian consciousness that it influenced their language itself. The hieroglyphic symbols for traveling north depicted boats with sails down and oars extended, while traveling south was represented by boats with sails raised, even when referring to overland journeys. From the earliest periods, Egyptians constructed boats from the materials available to them. The first vessels were simple craft made by binding together long stalks of papyrus reeds, creating lightweight skiffs suitable for fishing, hunting waterfowl in the marshes, and short trips along the river. These papyrus boats had a distinctive elongated U shape with upturned ends, a form that would later be replicated in wooden vessels. As Egyptian society grew more complex and ambitious, the need for larger, more durable boats became apparent. Wood, however, was scarce in Egypt. The native trees, primarily acacia, sycamore, and tamarisk, did not produce timber of sufficient size or quality for large-scale shipbuilding. To meet this need, Egypt turned to trade, importing cedar wood from Lebanon, a commodity so valuable that it became one of the primary reasons for establishing trade relationships with the Levant. Egyptian wooden boats were marvels of ancient engineering, constructed without nails through a technique of joining short planks with wooden pegs and binding them tightly with rope. The flat-bottom design, inherited from the papyrus boats, made them stable on the calm waters of the Nile, though they lacked keels and were therefore less suited to the rougher conditions of open sea. Steering was accomplished using large rudder oars at the stern, requiring skilled pilots who understood the river's moods, its sandbars and currents, its seasonal variations in depth and flow. The Egyptians developed specialized vessels for different purposes, cargo ships capable of carrying enormous loads, including massive stone blocks weighing as much as 500 tons from quarries to construction sites, elegant passenger vessels for officials and the wealthy, and ceremonial boats adorned with gold and precious materials for religious processions and royal funerals. Some tombs contained multiple boats, including that of Tutankhamun, which held 35 vessels of various types, reflecting the belief that boats were necessary for journeying to the afterlife and traveling across the celestial realms with the sun god Ra. The landscape beyond the river's fertile banks was one of extreme harshness. By the time the Great Pyramids were being built, around 2500 BCE, the Sahara had already transformed into the hyper-arid desert we recognize today, though it had been a very different place in earlier millennia. Between approximately 12,000 and 5,000 years ago, during what scientists call the African humid period, this region had been a savanna grassland dotted with shallow lakes, braided rivers, acacia and hackberry trees, supporting populations of elephants, giraffes, hippopotami, and crocodiles. Rock paintings from this period depict hunters with bows and arrows, herders with cattle, people gathering wild grains and fishing in abundant waters. But as the African monsoons shifted southward and Mediterranean winds returned to their normal patterns, the region underwent rapid desertification over just a few hundred years. Vegetation disappeared, which in turn caused even less rain to fall, as light-colored, plantless land reflected rather than absorbed sunlight, producing fewer of the warm, moist updrafts that form clouds. By 2000 BCE, the Sahara was as dry as it is today, and the last lakes had evaporated by 1000 BCE. The people who had lived in these once green regions were forced to migrate, and many scholars believe that some settled along the Nile, contributing to the population that would become the ancient Egyptians. This environmental history explains the Egyptian worldview. They inhabited a narrow strip of miraculous fertility surrounded on all sides by deadly, lifeless desert. The contrast was not gradual but immediate. One could stand with one foot on dark, moist soil and the other on pale, burning sand. This geography fostered a profound sense of dependence on the Nile, a recognition that the river was literally the difference between life and death, between civilization and oblivion. The climate itself was one of extremes. The desert heat was relentless, with daytime temperatures often soaring well above comfortable levels, while nights could become surprisingly cool, especially in the winter months. Rainfall was minimal to non-existent in most of Egypt. The annual precipitation in some areas amounted to less than 100 millimeters, barely enough to dampen the sand. This meant that the Nile was not merely important for agriculture, but also for drinking water, for washing, for every aspect of daily hydration and cleanliness. Interestingly, many Egyptians avoided drinking water directly from the Nile, having observed that people sometimes fell ill after consuming it, perhaps due to waterborne pathogens. Instead, beer, which was brewed through a process that involved boiling and fermentation, became the primary beverage for people of all ages and social classes, providing not only hydration, but also essential nutrients, proteins, minerals, and vitamins. The environment shaped Egyptian architecture in fundamental ways. With wood scarce and stone reserved for temples and tombs, the primary building material for homes was mud brick, made from the abundant Nile silt. After the annual floods receded, workers would collect the moist, fertile mud from the riverbanks, mix it with straw or chaff to add binding strength and prevent cracking, then press the mixture into wooden molds. These bricks were then left to dry in the intense sun for several days until they became hard and durable, ready to be stacked and mortared together to form walls. The process was simple, inexpensive, and sustainable, requiring no fuel for firing and utilizing materials that were literally deposited for free each year by the flooding river. Mud brick houses had remarkable thermal properties perfectly suited to the climate. The thick walls, often half a meter or more in depth, absorbed heat during the scorching days, but released it slowly, keeping interiors surprisingly cool. At night, when desert temperatures dropped, the walls would radiate the stored warmth inward, maintaining a comfortable environment for sleeping. Small, high windows were strategically placed to allow air circulation and light, while minimizing the entry of direct sunlight and blowing sand. Roofs were flat, constructed from palm fronds or reeds laid across wooden beams and covered with a layer of mud, creating additional living space that families used for sleeping during hot nights, for drying foods, and for storage. The layout of Egyptian homes varied dramatically according to social class, yet all shared certain fundamental features dictated by climate and available materials. The homes of common farmers and laborers were modest structures, often consisting of just 1 or 2 rooms with earthen floors and minimal furnishing. A central courtyard, open to the sky, served as the heart of domestic activity, where cooking was done over clay ovens, where women ground grain and baked bread, where children played, and where much of daily life unfolded under the open air rather than within enclosed spaces. The scarcity of furniture meant that people sat on woven mats or simple wooden stools, slept on reed mats or low platforms, and stored their possessions in baskets or ceramic jars. The simplicity was born not merely of poverty, but of practicality. In such a climate, less encumbrance meant greater comfort, less to maintain, less to heat or cool. Wealthier households enjoyed significantly more elaborate accommodations, though they too adhered to the fundamental principles of mud brick construction and courtyard-centered design. The estates of nobles and high officials might include multiple stories, with staircases leading to upper chambers where the family's private quarters were located, away from the bustle of servants and visitors below. These homes featured multiple courtyards, some dedicated to formal reception of guests, others to domestic tasks, and still others to private family relaxation, perhaps containing small gardens with carefully tended date palms, sycamore figs, or ornamental flowers that required constant watering from wells or channels connected to the Nile. Walls in wealthy homes were sometimes plastered smooth and painted with geometric patterns, scenes from nature, or protective symbols meant to ward off evil spirits. Floors might be tiled or paved with stone, and wooden furniture, carved and sometimes inlaid with ivory or precious materials, would include proper beds with woven rope mattresses, cushioned chairs, and chests for storing fine linen clothing and jewelry. Even in the grandest estates, however, the fundamental constraint remained the same. Egypt was a civilization that preserved stone for eternity and gods, building temples and tombs that would last forever, while accepting that homes, even palaces, were temporary structures that would eventually crumble back into the earth from which they came. This distinction reveals something profound about Egyptian priorities and worldview. The house was for this life, the tomb for the next, and the resources and craftsmanship were allocated accordingly, ensuring that what truly mattered, the journey into the afterlife and the dwelling places of the gods, would endure through countless generations. The food that sustained this civilization was as closely tied to the Nile as the homes that sheltered it. Bread was the absolute foundation of the Egyptian diet, consumed by everyone from the lowliest laborer to the pharaoh himself. The process of making bread was labor-intensive, beginning with the grinding of grain, a task typically performed by women using stone grinding mills called querns. The grain, usually barley or emmer wheat, was placed on the lower stone, and a second stone was rubbed back and forth over it, crushing the kernels into flour through sheer physical effort that could take hours each day. To speed the process, sand was sometimes added to the grain as an abrasive, which unfortunately meant that the finished bread often contained fine particles of grit that gradually wore down teeth over years of consumption. a dental problem clearly visible in the examination of ancient mummies. Once the flour was produced, it was mixed with water and sometimes a leavening agent, formed into dough and shaped into various forms, ranging from simple flat loaves to elaborate shapes resembling animals, fish, or human figures. The dough could be enriched with dates, honey, or herbs for special occasions, though everyday bread was plain and dense. Baking was done in clay ovens, on hot stones, or even buried in embers, depending on the desired texture and the resources available. The Egyptians developed dozens of bread varieties, some using finer flour, others incorporating fats or oils, some heavily leavened to create lighter, airier loaves, and others remaining flat and dense. Bread was so central to life that it was used as a form of currency, with workers, including the pyramid builders, receiving rations of bread as part of their payment. Beer, as mentioned earlier, was equally essential and was consumed daily by virtually everyone. The brewing process began by sprouting barley, which produced enzymes necessary for fermentation. The sprouted grain was then dried, ground into a mash, and mixed with water. Some sources suggest that lightly baked beer bread, which preserved the active yeasts, was crumbled into water and allowed to ferment, while other evidence points to a more direct brewing method, where sprouted grain was mixed with cooked grain to convert starches into fermentable sugars. The resulting beverage was thick, cloudy, nutritious, and somewhat similar to liquid bread, with a relatively low alcohol content compared to modern beers. Beer was often flavored with dates or herbs and was considered so valuable that it, like bread, was used as a measure of value in transactions and was prescribed in medical treatments. The pyramid builders at Giza received a daily ration of more than 10 pints of beer, providing essential calories and hydration for their demanding physical labor. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian diet included a variety of vegetables, many of which thrived in the irrigated fields along the Nile. Onions and garlic were particularly common, consumed both for their flavor and for their perceived medicinal properties. They were believed to provide strength and protection against illness. Leeks, cucumbers, lettuce, lentils, beans, peas, radishes, and turnips were all regularly cultivated and eaten, typically boiled into stews or consumed raw. Even papyrus, the plant used to make writing material, rope, sandals, and mats, had edible portions. The white pith could be eaten raw, boiled, or roasted, providing a readily available source of nutrition from the marshlands. Fruits were also part of the diet, with dates being the most ubiquitous, available in abundance and easily dried for long-term storage. Figs, grapes, melons, pomegranates, and occasionally apples were cultivated in gardens and orchards wherever water could be reliably supplied. Grapes were particularly valued by the wealthy, who pressed them into wine, mixing the fermented juice with spices and honey to create a beverage associated with status and celebration. Fish from the Nile were another important protein source, particularly for those who could not afford meat. Fish were caught using nets, traps, and hooks, then either consumed fresh or preserved through salting, drying, or smoking. Meat, by contrast, was expensive and largely the privilege of the wealthy and the elite. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were raised, but beef in particular was a luxury item reserved for special occasions and the tables of nobles and royalty. Poultry, including ducks, geese, and pigeons, were more accessible and were sometimes hunted in the marshes or raised in domestic flocks. Wealthier households might enjoy elaborately prepared roasted ducks or geese, sometimes stuffed with figs or dates for added richness. For most Egyptians, however, the daily meals were simple and repetitive: bread, beer, onions, lentils, perhaps some fish, and occasionally a bit of fresh fruit or vegetables, consumed twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. Clothing in ancient Egypt was designed with the same practical considerations that governed architecture and diet: the need to remain cool and comfortable in extreme heat. Linen, made from the fibers of the flax plant, was the overwhelmingly dominant fabric, valued for its lightness, breathability, and ability to be woven into cloth ranging from coarse utilitarian weaves to extraordinarily fine, almost transparent textiles. The process of creating linen was labor-intensive, beginning with the harvesting of flax plants, soaking the stems to separate the fibers, spinning those fibers into thread using simple spindles, and then weaving the thread on looms to create sheets of fabric. These skills of spinning, weaving, and sewing were considered essential, passed down from generation to generation, and were practiced primarily by women. The clothing itself was remarkably simple in form. Men typically wore a garment called a shenty, a wraparound skirt that was belted at the waist and could be pleated or gathered at the front for decoration. This skirt was short, ending above the knee for laborers and farmers who needed freedom of movement, and somewhat longer for men of higher status. In the heat of the day, many workers, particularly those in fields or construction sites, wore little more than loincloths, or even worked entirely naked, a practical adaptation to the brutal temperatures. Women wore simple sheath dresses, essentially straight tubes of linen held up by one or two shoulder straps, fitting close to the body and extending to the ankles. The finer the linen and the more elaborate the pleating or decoration, the higher the wearer's social status. The wealthy distinguished themselves not through dramatically different garments, but through the quality of their linen and the addition of jewelry, accessories, and decorative elements. The finest linen was so delicate that it was nearly see-through, a sheer fabric that was layered for modesty while still allowing air to circulate. White was the preferred color, symbolizing purity and cleanliness, though fabric could be dyed using plant-based dyes to produce reds, yellows, blues, and other colors for special occasions or ceremonial purposes. Royal and noble garments might be adorned with gold thread, elaborate beadwork, embroidery, or precious stones woven into broad collars, bracelets, and belts. Jewelry was not merely decorative, but held deep symbolic and protective significance for the ancient Egyptians. Both men and women of all social classes wore jewelry, though the materials varied dramatically according to wealth. Common people might wear simple copper bangles, strings of beads made from faience, a glazed ceramic material, or amulets carved from limestone. The wealthy adorned themselves with gold, which Egypt possessed in abundance from mines in Nubia and the eastern desert, and with semi-precious stones including turquoise from Sinai, carnelian, lapis lazuli imported from distant Afghanistan, and malachite. These materials were crafted into elaborate necklaces, particularly the broad collar known as the usek, which covered the chest and shoulders in concentric rows of beads and amulets. Rings, bracelets, earrings, anklets, and pectorals were all common, often featuring protective symbols such as the Eye of Horus, the Ankh symbolizing life, scarab beetles representing rebirth, or images of gods and goddesses believed to offer divine protection. Children in ancient Egypt wore no clothing until they reached approximately 6 years of age, a practical acknowledgement of the heat and the fact that young children were not yet subject to the modesty concerns of adults. Children wore jewelry, anklets, bracelets, collars, and elaborate hair accessories that identified their family status and provided magical protection. Once they reached an appropriate age, children dressed in the same styles as their parents, boys in skirts and girls in simple dresses, gradually assuming the appearance and responsibilities of adult life. Footwear was minimal, with most Egyptians going barefoot most of the time, hardening the soles of their feet against hot sand and rough terrain. Sandals, made from papyrus reeds, leather, or woven palm fibers, were worn primarily on special occasions during formal events, or when the terrain was particularly harsh. Even wealthy individuals often carried their sandals rather than wearing them, putting them on only when necessary to preserve them and to maintain the comfort of bare feet. Wigs were popular among both men and women of the upper classes, made from human hair or horsehair, and often elaborately styled with braids, curls, or geometric arrangements. These wigs served multiple purposes: protecting the head from the sun, keeping lice and other pests away from natural hair, which was often shaved short or removed entirely for hygiene, and serving as a platform for ornaments and displays of wealth. The people who created the monumental architecture that defines ancient Egypt in the modern imagination were not slaves laboring under the whip, but organized, skilled workers, fed, housed, and compensated for their efforts. The construction of the Great Pyramids, particularly the Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, required approximately 4,000 primary laborers, including quarry workers who cut the massive stone blocks, hauliers who transported them, and masons who fitted them into place with astonishing precision. Supporting these primary workers were an additional 16,000 to 20,000 secondary workers who built ramps, made and repaired tools, mixed mortar, supplied food and water, produced clothing and sandals, transported fuel, and provided all the logistical support necessary for such an enormous undertaking. This gives a total workforce of approximately 20,000 to 25,000 people, laboring for 20 years or more to complete a single pyramid. The workforce was highly organized, divided into large groups called philes, each containing around 2,000 workers, which were further subdivided into smaller teams of approximately 200 individuals. This hierarchical structure allowed for efficient coordination and management of tasks that would otherwise have been overwhelming. Workers were rotated, with temporary laborers brought in during the inundation season when farming was impossible and agricultural workers were available for other projects. This system had multiple benefits. It prevented any single community from being overburdened. It provided employment and income during the agricultural off-season, and it fostered a sense of shared national purpose and participation in monumental royal projects. The workers were not unpaid or forced. They received rations of bread, beer, vegetables, and occasionally meat, along with shelter in purpose-built workers' villages, such as the famous settlement near the pyramids at Giza. Archaeological excavations of these villages reveal organized housing, bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves daily, breweries, workshops for tool making and repair, and even medical facilities for treating injuries. The discovery of the Diary of Merer, a papyrus document dating to the reign of Khufu, provides a detailed account of the logistics of pyramid construction, including the transportation of limestone blocks from quarries by boat and the organization of work teams, offering invaluable insight into the practical realities of these massive projects. The methods of construction remain subjects of scholarly debate, but certain elements are clear. The massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons, were quarried using copper chisels that had to be repeatedly sharpened and tempered, and dolerite hammers, an extremely hard stone that could pound even granite. Experimental archaeology has shown that 12 men working barefoot could quarry 186 stone blocks in 21 days, demonstrating both the efficiency of ancient workers and the immense time investment required. Once quarried, the blocks were transported to the construction site using sledges pulled across wooden rollers or logs, with water poured onto the sand to reduce friction, a technique depicted in tomb paintings. The blocks were then raised into place using ramps, the exact configuration of which remains uncertain. Theories include straight ramps, spiral ramps that wound around the pyramid, or internal ramps built within the structure itself. What is remarkable is not merely the scale, but the precision. The Great Pyramid was oriented to the cardinal directions with extraordinary accuracy, its base forming an almost perfect square, and its internal passages and chambers aligned with astronomical significance. This required not only physical labor, but advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, surveying, and engineering, skills possessed by the scribes, architects, and priests who planned and supervised the construction. The society that created such wonders was rigidly hierarchical, structured like a pyramid itself, with the pharaoh at the apex. The pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living god, believed to be the earthly incarnation of Horus during his lifetime and destined to merge with Osiris upon death. This divine kingship was fundamental to Egyptian ideology. The pharaoh maintained cosmic order, known as Ma'at, through his rule, performing rituals, enacting laws, leading armies, and serving as the intermediary between the gods and the people. Below the pharaoh stood the vizier, the highest-ranking official, responsible for overseeing the government, the judiciary, and the administration of the entire kingdom. The vizier was the pharaoh's chief advisor, the implementer of royal will, and the coordinator of the vast bureaucracy necessary to manage a civilization stretching over 600 miles along the Nile. The elite class included nobles, who were often related to the royal family and who governed regions called nomes, essentially acting as provincial governors with authority over local laws, tax collection, and security. High-ranking priests formed another crucial segment of the elite, managing the temples, performing the daily rituals necessary to maintain the god's presence and favor, and controlling the enormous wealth accumulated by religious institutions. Temples were not only centers of worship, but also major economic entities, owning vast estates, employing thousands of people, and functioning as centers of learning, administration, and redistribution of goods. Priests underwent rigorous purification rituals to maintain the state of purity necessary for approaching the gods, bathing in sacred lakes, wearing special linen garments, and using ceremonial implements during daily temple rituals. The most important of these rituals was the opening of the mouth ceremony, performed each morning to symbolically restore the senses and life force to the cult statue of the deity residing in the temple's inner sanctuary. The priest, acting on behalf of the pharaoh, would enter the dark sanctuary, break the seal on the shrine's doors, open them, and greet the god with hymns and prostrations. Incense would be lit to purify the space, and the statue would be brought forth, washed with sacred water, anointed with precious oils, dressed in fresh linen garments, and adorned with jewelry. Food offerings were then presented: bread, meat, fruits, vegetables, beer, wine, all arranged on elaborate offering tables before the deity. The god was believed to consume the spiritual essence of these offerings, after which the physical food could be redistributed, passing first to other statues within the temple, then to funerary chapels where it sustained the spirits of the dead, and finally to the priests themselves, who consumed it as part of their compensation. This system of reversion of offerings served both religious and economic functions, ensuring that the enormous quantities of food presented to the gods each day did not go to waste, while also supporting the temple staff and their families. Temples were architectural marvels designed to represent the cosmos in stone. The entrance was marked by massive pylons, sloping walls that symbolized the mountains on the horizon, decorated with reliefs depicting the pharaoh smiting enemies and making offerings to the gods. Beyond the pylons lay open courtyards where festival processions would occur, and where ordinary people could gather during special occasions. Progressing deeper into the temple, one entered hypostyle halls, forests of colossal columns often carved and painted to resemble papyrus or lotus plants, creating the impression of walking through the primordial marsh from which creation emerged. The floor level gradually rose and the ceilings gradually lowered as one moved toward the sanctuary, while light diminished until the innermost chamber, the sanctuary itself, was plunged in total darkness except when opened for ritual. This architectural progression symbolized the journey from the outer world of chaos and multiplicity toward the inner realm of divine unity and cosmic order. The sanctuary housed the naos, a cabinet-like shrine containing the cult statue, or sometimes a sacred bark, a model boat on which the statue rested and which was used to carry it during festivals. The imagery adorning temple walls recorded myths, rituals, historical events, and the eternal relationship between pharaohs and gods. These were not mere decorations, but active participants in the temple's magical function. The images and inscriptions perpetually performing the rites depicted, ensuring that the temple's purpose continued even when no human was present. Magic, known as Heika, was understood as a fundamental force of the universe, and rituals were means of manipulating this force, equating actions in the human realm with corresponding effects in the divine realm. By magically identifying himself with a god, a priest could interact directly with divine powers, maintaining the delicate balance that kept chaos at bay and allowed creation to persist. Festivals were times when this normally hidden divine presence emerged into the public sphere, when the statues of gods were carried from their dark sanctuaries in grand processions through the streets, allowing the common people to see, celebrate, and connect with the divine. These festivals were known as Heb and were central to the religious, social, and economic life of ancient Egypt. The Egyptian calendar was structured around these festivals, with the year divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra epagomenal days that were considered outside normal time, each dedicated to the birth of a different deity: Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. The year itself was divided into 3 seasons corresponding to the agricultural cycle: Akhet, the season of inundation when the Nile flooded, roughly July through October; Pere, the season of growth and emergence when crops sprouted and grew, roughly November through February; and Shemu, the season of harvest when the mature crops were gathered. roughly March through June. Festivals marked the transitions between these seasons and celebrated the agricultural abundance on which Egyptian civilization depended. One of the most important festivals was Wepet Renpet, the New Year, celebrated around mid-July when the Nile began its annual rise, and the star Sirius reappeared on the horizon after a period of invisibility. This cosmic coincidence of celestial and terrestrial phenomena was interpreted as a divine renewal, a time of feasting, offerings, and celebration that emphasized the eternal, cyclical nature of life. The festival of Opet, held in the second month of the inundation season, involved an elaborate procession in which the statue of the god Amun was carried by boat from the massive temple complex of Karnak to the temple at Luxor, several miles away, accompanied by music, dancing, and offerings. This festival reinforced the divine legitimacy of the pharaoh and the connection between the ruling dynasty and the gods. The Feast of the Valley, celebrated during the inundation season, honored the dead, with processions to the necropolis where families made offerings and prayers for their deceased ancestors, maintaining the vital link between the living and the dead. The beautiful Feast of the Valley was a grander version celebrated during the New Kingdom period, involving processions of divine statues visiting the tombs of deceased royalty. Festivals honoring Sokar and Osiris were particularly elaborate, involving ritual circumambulations of temple walls, reenactments of mythological events, the raising of the Djed pillar symbolizing Osiris's resurrection, and agricultural rituals, such as the plowing of soil to release Osiris's life force hidden in the earth in the form of seeds. During these festivals, people wore necklaces of onions, believed to be associated with the teeth of Osiris or Horus, and linked to the opening of the mouth ritual that revived the five senses. Processions of sacred barks, elaborate model boats carrying divine statues, wound through the streets with priests bearing incense and torches, musicians playing drums and sistrums, singers chanting hymns, and crowds of celebrants following along. Markets, banquets, and social gatherings accompanied these religious observances, making festivals occasions not only of worship, but of communal joy, economic activity, and cultural expression. For the common people, festivals provided rare opportunities to approach the divine presence directly, to witness the statues of the gods emerging from their temples, and to participate in rituals that normally occurred hidden within restricted sacred spaces. This visibility reinforced the belief structure that the world operated according to divine will as interpreted by priests and implemented by the pharaoh, and that each person, no matter how humble, had a place within this cosmic order. Trade extended Egypt's influence far beyond the Nile Valley, connecting the civilization to a vast network of exchange that spanned Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean world. Egypt's agricultural abundance, particularly grain, made it a vital exporter of foodstuffs capable of feeding populations across the region. Papyrus, which grew prolifically in the Nile marshes, was another major export, highly valued throughout the ancient world as the primary writing material until the widespread adoption of parchment and paper centuries later. Egypt also exported gold from Nubian mines, linen textiles, salted fish, and manufactured goods including pottery and faience objects. In return, Egypt imported materials it lacked, most notably high-quality timber, particularly cedar from Lebanon, essential for constructing large boats, roof beams, furniture, and coffins. Tin and copper were imported from Anatolia and Cyprus, necessary for producing bronze tools and weapons. Olive oil came from the Mediterranean islands and the Levant, along with wine, which was highly prized by Egyptian elites. Luxury items included lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, incense such as frankincense and myrrh from Punt, located along the coast of modern Somalia and Eritrea, and various precious stones, spices, and exotic animals. Trade routes were both maritime and overland. Ships sailed along the Nile into the Mediterranean to reach Crete, Greece, and the Levantine coast, and through the Red Sea to access the Arabian Peninsula and the African coast. The Via Sinaitica connected Egypt to the Levant, while desert caravan routes linked the Nile Valley to Nubia in the south and to oases in the western desert. These trade networks facilitated not only the movement of goods, but also the exchange of ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and religious concepts. Egyptian art influenced Nubian architecture, while foreign deities and motifs found their way into Egyptian religious iconography, demonstrating the cultural permeability that existed alongside political and economic interactions. Egypt's strategic location between three continents made it a natural hub, and its control of both the Nile and access to the Red Sea and Mediterranean gave it tremendous commercial advantages. The construction of canals to facilitate ship passage and improve trade efficiency demonstrates the priority Egyptians placed on maintaining these commercial connections. The Kush Kingdom and Nubia played particularly important roles, serving as conduits connecting Egypt to the resources and peoples of deeper Africa, resulting in such extensive cultural exchange that the Nubians adopted Egyptian burial practices, including mummification, pyramid construction, and worship of Egyptian gods. The craftsmen who produced the goods for both domestic use and trade were essential members of Egyptian society, occupying a middle position in the social hierarchy, below nobles and scribes, but above common laborers and farmers. These artisans specialized in various crafts: carpenters who worked with precious imported wood to create furniture, boats, and architectural elements; stonemasons and sculptors who carved the colossal statues, reliefs, and sarcophagi that filled temples and tombs; jewelers who crafted elaborate ornaments from gold and precious stones; potters who shaped the countless vessels needed for storage, cooking, and ritual; weavers who produced linen textiles; leather workers who made sandals, bags, and straps; and specialists in making papyrus scrolls, paint pigments, cosmetics, and countless other necessities. Craftsmen typically worked in organized workshops, often located near temples or palaces, and lived in designated communities such as Deir el-Medina, the famous village that housed the artisans who built and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These workshops were hierarchical, with master craftsmen overseeing apprentices who learned their trade through years of practice, copying models, and gradually developing the skills necessary for independent work. Sculptors' workshops contained practice models, usually carved from soft limestone, allowing apprentices to refine their techniques before working on actual monuments. The tools used by ancient craftsmen were remarkably effective despite their simplicity. Carpenters used saws, axes, chisels, adzes for shaping wood, bow drills for making holes, and wooden mallets. Stonemasons employed dolerite hammers to pound granite and copper chisels, repeatedly tempered to maintain their edges, along with abrasive sand for smoothing and polishing. Jewelers used techniques including casting, hammering, inlaying, engraving, and cloisonne, creating intricate designs with extraordinary precision. Potters worked with Nile clay, preparing it by removing impurities, adding tempering agents such as sand or straw, and shaping it either by hand using coiling techniques or on potter's wheels that became increasingly sophisticated over the centuries. The potter's wheel, introduced during the Old Kingdom, was initially a slow, manually operated device, but by the New Kingdom, faster wheels allowed for greater speed and symmetry in production. Once shaped, pottery was often coated with slip, a thin layer of liquid clay that smoothed the surface and could provide color, then decorated with incised patterns, impressed designs, or painted motifs before being fired in kilns at temperatures up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. The firing process transformed soft clay into durable ceramics, with variations in atmosphere and temperature producing different effects, such as the distinctive black-topped pottery of the Naqada period, created by restricting oxygen at the rim during firing. Papyrus production was a specialized craft of enormous economic importance. The papyrus plant, Cyperus papyrus, grew abundantly in the marshes of the delta and along the Nile's banks, reaching heights of several meters with distinctive triangular stems crowned by feathery umbels. To make writing material, workers harvested the plant and cut the lower portion of the stem into manageable lengths, typically 20 to 30 centimeters. The outer green rind was peeled away, revealing the white pith inside, which was then sliced lengthwise into thin strips. These strips were laid out side by side on a flat surface, slightly overlapping, to form one layer. Then a second layer of strips was placed perpendicular to the first, creating a crosshatch pattern. The two layers were then hammered or pressed together while moist, causing the natural sugars in the papyrus to act as an adhesive, fusing the strips into a single, cohesive sheet. The sheet was left to dry in the sun, then polished with a smooth object such as a shell, piece of ivory, or polished stone to create an even, receptive writing surface. Individual sheets could be glued together edge to edge using starch-based paste to create long rolls, sometimes extending many meters, ideal for lengthy texts. The quality of papyrus varied depending on the skill of the artisan and the care taken during production. The finest papyrus was pure white, smooth, and free of blemishes, suitable for important documents and religious texts, while lower-grade papyrus, coarser and less carefully made, sufficed for everyday records and practice writing. Papyrus was so valuable that it was frequently recycled, with used sheets washed and reused, or texts written on the verso, the side with vertical fibers, when the recto had already been filled. Beyond writing material, papyrus was used to make rope, sandals, baskets, mats, and even boats, demonstrating the versatility of this remarkable plant. Scribes who could read and write held privileged positions in Egyptian society, ranking above craftsmen and laborers despite not being part of the noble elite. Literacy was rare, with perhaps only 1 to 3% of the population possessing the ability to read and write the complex hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts. To become a scribe required years of training in special schools, where boys, and very rarely girls, would spend 4 to 5 years memorizing hundreds of signs and practicing writing on potsherds, limestone flakes called ostraca, or old pieces of papyrus. Students copied texts repeatedly, developing the hand control and knowledge necessary for professional work. Scribes were essential to government administration, recording tax assessments, tracking agricultural yields, documenting legal transactions, maintaining correspondence between officials, copying religious texts for temple libraries, and keeping the detailed records that allowed the Egyptian state to function. They used reed brushes dipped in ink made from soot mixed with water for black and ground ochre for red, writing on papyrus, or occasionally on prepared leather. The scribe's kit typically included a palette with indentations for ink cakes, a water pot, and a holder for brushes, all easily portable for working in the field or in administrative offices. The position of scribe was often hereditary, with sons following their fathers into the profession, though occasionally craftsmen's sons could gain admission to scribe schools, providing a rare path for social mobility. The work was mentally demanding, but physically easy compared to agricultural labor or construction work, making the scribe's life relatively comfortable, a fact celebrated in Egyptian literature, where scribal texts boast of the advantages of their profession over other occupations. The belief system that permeated every aspect of Egyptian life was centered on a complex pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with specific domains of influence, mythological narratives, and cult centers. The supreme solar deity Ra, sometimes merged with Amun to become Amun-Ra, was considered the king of the gods, the creator who brought the world into being and who journeyed across the sky each day in his solar bark before descending into the underworld at night to battle the serpent of chaos, Apophis, and emerge victorious at dawn. This daily cycle of death and rebirth mirrored the Egyptian understanding of existence itself, reinforcing beliefs about the afterlife and the eternal nature of the cosmos. Osiris, originally a god of agriculture and vegetation, became the lord of the underworld and judge of the dead, central to Egyptian funerary beliefs. According to mythology, Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, god of chaos and storms, then resurrected through the magic of his wife Isis, the great mother goddess of magic, healing, and protection. Their son, Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, avenged his father, reclaiming the throne and establishing the divine order that each pharaoh inherited upon ascending to kingship. This mythological narrative provided the template for understanding death, resurrection, and rightful rule. Other major deities included Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and guide of souls to the afterlife; Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing; and the moon, who served as scribe to the gods; Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy, often depicted as a cow or as a woman with cow's horns; Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, patron of craftsmen and builders; Bastet, the cat goddess associated with protection and domesticity; Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and healing; Sobek, the crocodile god of the Nile's power and fertility; and many others. Each nome had its own principal deity, and individual gods had multiple cult centers where they were worshipped with particular intensity. The gods were not understood as abstract concepts, but as real entities with personalities, relationships, and the ability to influence human affairs directly. They could take multiple forms, appearing as animals, humans, or hybrid creatures, and could merge with one another, creating complex divine identities such as Ra-Horakti or Ptah-Sokar Osiris. The flexibility of Egyptian theology allowed for regional variations and historical evolution while maintaining core beliefs about divine order, Ma'at, the fundamental principle of truth, justice, and cosmic balance that the gods maintained and that humans were obligated to uphold. The concept of the afterlife was deeply important to ancient Egyptians, who believed that death was not an end, but a transformation, a passage to another existence that, if properly prepared for, could be even more desirable than earthly life. This belief drove the elaborate funerary practices for which Egypt is famous, including mummification, tomb construction, and the provision of grave goods. The process of mummification was designed to preserve the body, which was understood as necessary for the survival of the spirit in the afterlife. The Egyptian conception of the soul was complex, involving multiple spiritual components. The Ka, a life force or double that remained in the tomb and required sustenance through offerings. The Ba, often depicted as a human-headed bird, which could travel between the tomb and the outside world. And the Ak, the transfigured spirit that, after successfully passing judgment, would dwell among the stars or accompany the gods. For these spiritual elements to function properly, the body needed to be preserved as an earthly anchor. Mummification was a 70-day process conducted by specialized priests known as embalmers. The body was first washed and purified with natron, a naturally occurring salt. The brain was then removed through the nasal cavity using a hooked instrument, the organ being considered unimportant and therefore discarded. An incision was made in the left side of the abdomen, through which the internal organs were carefully removed. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were preserved separately, treated with natron, wrapped in linen, and placed in canopic jars, each protected by a different deity. The heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory, was left inside the body, as it would be needed during the judgment in the afterlife. The body cavity and the outer surfaces were then packed and covered with natron, which desiccated the tissues over approximately 40 days, removing all moisture while preserving the skin and soft tissues. Once desiccation was complete, the natron was removed, and the body was washed again and anointed with oils and resins, both for preservation and for ritual purification. The body cavity was filled with linen, sawdust, or other materials to restore a more lifelike shape, and sometimes artificial eyes were inserted to make the mummy appear more complete. The final stage was wrapping, which could involve hundreds of meters of linen bandages, each layer carefully arranged and coated with resin to bind them together. Amulets and protective charms were placed between the layers at specific locations, providing magical protection for the journey through the underworld. The wrapping process could take up to 15 days and was accompanied by prayers and ritual recitations. The finished mummy was placed in a coffin, which might be nested inside one or more additional coffins, depending on the deceased's wealth, and finally placed in a sarcophagus, often elaborately decorated with protective spells and images of gods. The funeral itself was a major event, involving processions from the place of embalming to the tomb, with professional mourners wailing and tearing their clothes, priests reciting spells, and family members following behind. At the tomb entrance, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, touching various parts of the mummy with ritual instruments to symbolically restore the deceased's ability to see, hear, speak, eat, and breathe in the afterlife. The mummy was then placed in the burial chamber along with grave goods, furniture, clothing, jewelry, food, drink, tools, weapons, cosmetics, games, and sometimes model servants called shabtis, figurines that would magically come to life and perform labor on behalf of the deceased in the afterlife. The tomb walls were decorated with scenes of daily life, agricultural activities, banquets, religious rituals, and texts from funerary literature such as the pyramid texts, coffin texts, or Book of the Dead. Collections of spells and instructions designed to guide the deceased through the dangers of the underworld and ensure successful resurrection. These texts described the journey of the soul, the challenges it would face, the passwords needed to pass through gates guarded by demons, and most importantly, the final judgment before Osiris. In this judgment, the deceased's heart was weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, symbolizing truth and justice. If the heart was heavier than the feather, burdened by sin and wrongdoing, it would be devoured by Ammit, a composite demon with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, resulting in the deceased's complete annihilation. If the heart balanced with the feather, proving the deceased had lived a just and righteous life, they would be granted entry into the field of reeds, a paradise resembling the best of earthly Egypt, where they would dwell in peace and abundance forever. This profound concern with the afterlife influenced Egyptian behavior during life, encouraging adherence to Ma'at, ethical conduct, performance of religious duties, and care for one's family and community. It also drove enormous expenditure of resources on tomb construction and funerary preparations, with wealthy individuals beginning work on their tombs early in life, ensuring they would have a proper, eternal home. The deserts that surrounded the Nile Valley, though hostile and dangerous, also provided valuable resources. The eastern desert contained quarries of fine stone, including granite, basalt, and precious minerals, while the western desert held oases that served as waypoints for trade caravans. The deserts also served as natural barriers, protecting Egypt from invasion and allowing the civilization to develop in relative isolation for long periods. The climate's hyperaridity preserved organic materials remarkably well, including wood, textiles, and even food, allowing modern archaeologists to study ancient Egyptian material culture with extraordinary detail impossible in more humid environments. The contrast between the narrow green strip of the Nile Valley and the vast, empty deserts beyond influenced Egyptian cosmology and worldview in fundamental ways. The Nile represented life, order, fertility, and divine blessing, while the desert symbolized death, chaos, foreignness, and danger. Yet the desert was also the realm of the dead, where tombs were placed on the west bank of the Nile in imitation of the sun's setting, associating the deceased with the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld before rebirth at dawn. This dualistic geography mirrored the Egyptian understanding of existence itself. Life and death, order and chaos, fertility and barrenness, all in dynamic balance, maintained through proper ritual, ethical conduct, and the pharaoh's divine mediation between the human and divine realms. The technological and organizational achievements of ancient Egypt emerged from practical responses to environmental challenges and opportunities. Basin irrigation developed because floods, though predictable, required management to maximize benefit. Monumental stone architecture emerged partly because stone was abundant and durable, suitable for structures meant to last eternally, while mud brick sufficed for temporary human dwellings. The development of writing responded to the administrative needs of an increasingly complex society that required accurate record-keeping for taxation, resource allocation, and maintenance of legal and religious traditions. Centuries of experience with the Nile's cycles, fostered agricultural expertise that made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world, capable of feeding not only its own population, but also exporting grain to neighboring civilizations. The predictability of the floods allowed for long-term planning, the accumulation of surpluses, and the development of a sophisticated economy that could support specialized crafts, monumental construction projects, and a large priestly and administrative class. The religious festivals that punctuated the year provided social cohesion, reminding the population of shared beliefs, collective identity, and their place within a divinely ordered cosmos. The immense effort invested in temples and tombs reflected not merely royal vanity, but genuine belief that these structures maintained the cosmic order, ensured divine favor, and allowed the deceased, especially the pharaohs, to continue protecting and benefiting Egypt even after death. Trade networks brought not only material goods, but also ideas, artistic influences, and technological innovations, ensuring that Egyptian civilization, despite its geographical isolation, remained connected to and influenced by the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. The adoption of the chariot and horse from Asia, the integration of foreign deities into the Egyptian pantheon, and the evolution of artistic styles all demonstrate that ancient Egypt, often portrayed as unchanging, was in fact dynamic and responsive to external contacts. The social hierarchy, while rigid, provided structure and stability, with each class understanding its role and obligations. Farmers produced food, craftsmen created necessary goods, scribes maintained records, priests conducted rituals, soldiers defended borders, officials administered regions, and the pharaoh unified all these functions under divine authority. This specialization allowed for the development of expertise in each domain, resulting in the artistic, architectural, and organizational achievements that define ancient Egyptian civilization. The tools and techniques developed by Egyptian craftsmen were passed down through generations, refined and improved, creating traditions of excellence that persisted for millennia. The same basic forms of pottery, the same artistic conventions in painting and sculpture, the same religious iconography, all remained recognizable across centuries, providing cultural continuity even as dynasties rose and fell, as borders expanded and contracted, as individual pharaohs came and went. Yet within this continuity, there was also change. Architectural styles evolved from step pyramids to true pyramids to rock-cut tombs. Religious emphasis shifted from Ra to Amun, to the brief monotheism of Akhenaten, and back to the traditional pantheon. Foreign rulers, including the Hyksos and later the Persians, Greeks, and Romans, would conquer Egypt, each leaving their mark, while also being absorbed to varying degrees into Egyptian cultural patterns. The ancient Egyptians themselves were aware of their history, preserving king lists, recording military campaigns, documenting religious reforms, and maintaining libraries of ancient texts. They looked back to earlier periods as golden ages, restored ancient monuments, copied archaic artistic styles, and sought to connect their present with a glorious past. This historical consciousness, combined with the physical durability of their stone monuments and the preservative qualities of the desert climate, ensured that Egyptian civilization would leave an extraordinary archaeological record, one that continues to reveal new insights into this remarkable culture. As night deepens over the desert, as stars wheel overhead in patterns the ancient Egyptians charted and incorporated into their temple alignments, as the Nile flows silently northward, as it has for thousands of years, we can imagine the daily rhythms that structured life in antiquity. The farmer rising before dawn to work fields moistened by the flood. The potter at the wheel, shaping clay into vessels that would hold grain and water. The scribe in the temple, carefully copying religious texts onto fresh papyrus. The priest entering the dark sanctuary, breaking the seal, greeting the god with hymns, performing rituals unchanged for centuries. The carpenter constructing a boat from precious cedar, knowing it would carry goods along the river, or perhaps serve a king in the afterlife. The jeweler setting turquoise into gold, creating amulets believed to protect the wearer in this life and the next. These were not mythical heroes, but real people, living real lives, shaped by the environment in which they found themselves, and by the beliefs they inherited and transmitted. They built homes from mud and straw, because that was what the river provided. They ate bread and drank beer, because barley and wheat grew abundantly in the flood-enriched soil. They wore linen, because flax thrived in their climate, and the fabric kept them cool. They mummified their dead, because they genuinely believed the body must be preserved for the soul to survive. They built pyramids and temples from stone, because they believed these structures were necessary for maintaining cosmic order and ensuring eternal life for their rulers, whose continued existence in the afterlife protected the living. The sophistication of ancient Egyptian civilization lay not in technology as we understand it today, but in the profound integration of practical knowledge, environmental adaptation, social organization, and religious belief into a coherent system that functioned successfully for over 3,000 years. Few civilizations have endured so long, maintained such cultural continuity, or left such an indelible mark on human history. The Nile gave life, and life centered on the Nile. The floods came and went, crops grew and were harvested, people were born and died, pharaohs ruled and were buried, temples rose and festivals celebrated the gods who sustained it all. This was the rhythm of ancient Egypt, a civilization built on predictability, on cycles, on the reliable return of water and sun, on the confidence that if rituals were performed correctly, if Ma'at was upheld, if offerings were made, then order would persist, chaos would be held at bay, and life, both in this world and the next, would continue. In the quiet darkness of a tomb sealed thousands of years ago, inscriptions still proclaim the names and deeds of the deceased, still promise resurrection, still guide the soul through the underworld with spells composed in an age when the world was young. Above ground, temples stand or lie in ruins, their columns reaching toward the sky, their walls covered with images of gods and kings, with hieroglyphs recording prayers and histories. The pyramids rise from the desert plateau, stone mountains built by human hands, eternal markers of a civilization's ambition and faith. The ancient Egyptians sought immortality through stone and ritual, through careful preservation of the body and meticulous provision for the afterlife. In a sense, they achieved it, for their monuments endure, their artifacts fill museums, their texts are still read and studied, their gods are still known, and the story of their civilization continues to fascinate, inspire, and instruct those who seek to understand the human experience across the vast expanse of time. Tonight, we have journeyed along the Nile, walked through mud brick villages and stone temples, observed the cycles of agriculture and the rituals of worship, witnessed the daily lives of farmers and craftsmen, priests and scribes, and glimpsed the profound beliefs that shaped every aspect of this remarkable civilization. We have seen how geography shaped culture, how practical necessities became sacred rituals, how the desire for eternal life drove artistic and architectural achievement, and how a single river flowing through desert gave birth to a civilization that would influence the world for millennia to come. As dawn approaches in our imagination, as the first light touches the eastern horizon and begins to drive back the darkness, we can picture the ancient Egyptians greeting the new day with prayers to Ra, welcoming the sun's rebirth, beginning again the endless cycle of work and worship, of life sustained by the Nile and faith in the gods who made all things possible. The river flows on, as it always has, carrying with it the memory of a civilization that rose along its banks, flourished under its blessing, and created wonders that time has not erased. May these images accompany you into sleep, gentle and peaceful, these scenes of ancient life unfolding under relentless sun and infinite stars, of temples filled with incense and hymns, of fields green with growing wheat, of boats with white sails gliding across calm water, of craftsmen at their work, of families gathered in courtyard shade, of the eternal desert beyond, and of the knowledge that human civilization, with all its beauty, complexity, and aspiration, has persisted through countless generations, each leaving its mark, each contributing to the great story that connects us all across time. Rest now, with the Nile flowing gently through the desert of dreams, with the pyramids standing silent in starlight, with the gods watching over their creation, with the promise that dawn will come again, as it always has, bringing light and life renewed, the eternal gift of the sun and the river that made ancient Egypt possible and whose legacy endures to this day.